This e-lecture will cover Chapter 7 in your textbook, which is Formulating Feedback for Clients. So let's get started. As a reminder, in solution building, solutions are not built by us as the experts, quote unquote, because, why? The client is the expert, correct. So solutions are actually built by our clients. We help guide that process using our professional skills that we have developed to ask the right questions and to dig deeper and to process and to support so that the client can then figure out what some of those solutions are that may be best for them. We also are not the ones that are the primary agents of change. The clients, not us, are the primary agents of change. So any kind of change that's going to be possible can only be made possible by the client. And this is why we empower them to seek their own solution, because it is more likely that they will try their own idea than it would be if we were to give them our idea. And then during our session, clients are going to give us information about themselves and the situation, about what they'd like instead, and all of those pieces. We use those pieces so that as we give feedback at the end of the session, we're merely just organizing and highlighting the parts of their session and the information they've given us that are going to be the most useful to them as they try to build solutions. So that really is the nutshell of what end of session feedback is built around. Is we're not creating something that is new, but we're using all the pieces that we've gathered. We're pulling out the things that are most important, organizing, highlighting, and then allowing that to help us construct our feedback. So after you've gone through the session and you've gotten a chance to gain the information that you need, ask the miracle question, maybe dig for exceptions and scaling, then it's time for the thinking break. This is usually 5 to 10 minutes, and you as a practitioner actually take this break. You remove yourself from the session, whether it is you step out of the office. If you're in an in-home, you might step outside just to collect your thoughts. And it happens towards the end of the session, right before you give the clients their end of session feedback. So make sure that you keep in mind when in the session this happens. So you've already asked everything, you've done exceptions, you've done scaling, and then you start to take the 10-minute or start to take the thinking break. Make sure that you mention that you're going to take this break while you clarify how you work. So way at the very beginning of the session, when you're doing names and small talk and then you move into clarifying how you work, if it is a session where you are going to take a thinking break, then let the client know then what they can expect. You may say something like, this session is going to be about 45 minutes, and towards the end of the session, I'm going to actually take what's called a thinking break, where I'm going to actually leave the room for about 5-10 minutes, and during that time, you'll be able to relax, maybe reflect on some things on your own, grab some water, and then it gives me a chance to just regroup, summarize the context of what we've discussed, and then come back and be able to provide you some feedback and suggestions based on our discussion today. And so that's what's going to happen at the end of the session. Make sure that you do let your clients know, because if you abruptly end your session and say, well, I'm going to take a break now, if you haven't forewarned your clients, it would seem very abrupt. It might make some feel a bit put off that you are leaving the room without giving them reasons. And so make sure you let them know early on in the session when you clarify how you work, and explain the purpose of why you take the thinking break. It's not just so that you can go and grab water and check your cell phone messages, but it really is for you to regroup. It gives you a time to just reflect on everything that's been discussed and pull out some of those highlighted pieces that you feel would help with the solution building process. So you leave the session and you might reflect alone, or if you're working in a team setting, then you might be able to reflect with your team. And then the client, you may also ask your client to do something during that session. You might just let them sit there and relax a little bit, or if there's something that you're wanting them to think on, maybe you want them to think of a suggestion for themselves based on what they've discussed and processed with you during the session. That's up to you. In this course, I don't distinguish it either way. This really is more of a solution-focused technique as far as taking thinking break and giving feedback. And so while I want you to have an idea of how you do it and why you do it and when you would use this skill, I'm also not as concerned about making sure that you have it done to perfection, because the reality is the other skills that you've learned up to this point, quite a few of those are more important to me personally that you really have mastered. But I want you to be able to practice and still see how this feels and use this as part of your skill repertoire. So there are three parts to feedback. We've got the compliments, and then we have the bridge and suggestions. And it really is pretty systematic. Compliments are just like what we've discussed already, where you're affirming what's important to the client. You're pulling out those strengths as well as those successes. So that's how you start off that feedback. So let's say you've just come back from the break. You've given yourself 5-10 minutes to reflect. You've given your client some time to think about what you all have discussed. And then when you come back, I often will say something like, thank you so much for allowing us to take that break. It was helpful for me to be able to think about all the things that we've discussed today. And we've discussed a lot. And it seems like we've made a lot of progress. And it's helped me to get a better understanding of what your ideas are and what your goals are. So compliment what is important to your client. Then you're going to move into the bridge, but before we do that, let's practice. So it says here, if I am a career-driven single female who works hard and gets rave reviews from my supervisor, what would be a compliment you could offer me? So something to start off. What would be something you would share? If you want to pause the presentation now and think about what would be a compliment you would offer this kind of a client, please do so now. So a possible compliment could be, Mary, thank you so much for waiting and for allowing us to have a thinking break. And as I was reflecting and thinking back on all that you've shared with me, I'm just so impressed with your commitment to success and how you have really put a lot of goals for yourself in your career and you've achieved them. And so often, so many people might have a lot of career goals, but they get stuck and they have a hard time making those things happen. And yet you continue to persist and you get amazing reviews from your supervisor. And I'm just amazed and impressed with your commitment to your work ethic and to your career. That's the kind of compliment that pulls out the strengths that I've noticed in the successes that Mary may have shared during the session. So that was one way you may have worded it slightly different, and that's okay as well, as long as you're affirming those things that are important to your client, their successes and their strengths. And that is the compliment piece of your feedback. So the bridge. This is literally like a bridge. It's the part of the feedback that links your initial compliment to your suggestion. So it's like a transitional statement. And it's easy to do this by either agreeing with what the reasons are the client is there. In our scenario with Mary, the previous situation that was just displayed on the previous slide. So she's a career-driven, she gets rave reviews at work. But let's say Mary's reason for coming to see you is that she's very stressed and she feels like she's dealing with more of a workaholic type of symptom where she's really just not allowing herself to have balance. So in that situation, I can think about what is it that Mary's wanting here and what is something that is an agreeable norm. And in this circumstance, it would be something like, Mary, I agree with you that it's important to have a balance in life, both with our work life as well as our personal life and every element that makes you who you are. It's nice and it's an important thing to strive to seek that balance and make sure that you feel like you're at a place where you are balanced in all aspects. Now, I agreed with her on that. You can make it even shorter and sweeter and just say something like, I agree with you that it's important to have a balance in your life. Therefore, and then you would move into the suggestion. So it really is that link. So putting all together from the previous slide when you start with the compliments, I would say something like, Mary, I've just been so impressed as I've heard all of your successes in your career and how driven you are and just your ability to set goals and achieve them. And it just speaks to the character that you have that says, I'm going to set a goal and I'm going to meet it. And that persistence and drive that you have. I also agree with you that it's important that while you have these career goals, that you figure out a balance on how to make those things balance out with the rest of your life and the rest of the aspects that make you who you are. Therefore, what I'm going to suggest is, so those are the first two parts, the compliment and the bridge. Now your suggestions. Here's the big question. How is this different from giving advice? Think on that. So many students will say, well, I thought we're not supposed to give advice, and now I'm giving them a suggestion. Erase the definition of a suggestion that you've had up to this point. Culturally, we think if I'm going to give somebody a suggestion, I'm going to tell them something that they should do, or I'm going to give them a piece of advice. In this context, within solution-focused therapy, we are not giving advice. Instead, we're going to be moving and compiling the information that we've already gathered. Remember, since we have been asking our clients all along what they want instead and what they have tried, those are some of the pieces that we can now draw from to help us to give suggestions back that really is just reiterating back to the client what they already have tried and maybe suggesting that they maybe try it again. So there are two kinds of suggestions. Observational, which is both of these are pretty true to the words used in them. So an observational client pays attention or they observe a particular aspect of their life that may be useful in solution building. So they actually look for those scenarios where that may happen. A behavioral suggestion requires the client to actually do something, to take a certain action that may be helpful in constructing a solution. For example, in our case of Mary, our workaholic, a suggestion that I could provide to her, let's say in the course of our discussion, I have found out that Mary felt that when she was able to set up a schedule in advance that included things that she wanted to do personally, whether it was exercise, whether it was a hobby, whether it was meeting with her family or friends, that setting up that schedule was helpful for her to keep a balance, because then she was able to structure her life in a way that she did give an equal balance to both work and her personal plans. So let's say Mary shared that earlier in the interview, and because I asked this, I now know that this is something that's helpful. Using that type of task that Mary has said has helped her in the past, these are two different ways you can do the observational. In one way, I might be able to say, Mary, I want you to pay attention to times during this next week when you feel like your life is a little bit more in balance than how it has been. Maybe there's something special that happens during the day. Maybe you do something different, but just keep an eye on yourself and take note of any days or moments where you feel like you're more in balance, and take note of what it is that's happening. So notice for this observational suggestion, Mary's not necessarily doing something actively, but she is going to be watching and observing. And then I want her to come back and tell me about what that was like and what did she observe about herself? What did she notice? If I was to do the same scenario but instead give Mary a behavioral suggestion, I might do something like this. So Mary, what I'd like to suggest is that in this next week, what I'd like you to do is maybe set up a plan. As you've mentioned before, you said a plan was very helpful to you so that you could keep balance of both your personal and your work life. And so if you would like to try to set up a plan for this next week, maybe you just do 1 or 2 activities for both personal and work life and put it on that plan and see how that feels to try that again, as you've mentioned it's worked. Notice that in that suggestion, Mary has to do something. Now she's actually actively setting up a plan and taking action. Those are the two differences. Observational, you're observing, you're having the client observe something or someone. Behavior, you're having them do something actively. You're there taking action. So keep that in mind, and that's why when you are finding out exceptions, when you're finding out pieces of the client's background, those kind of details are going to help you know which kind of suggestion you should provide. In this course, I know in the textbook it goes in depth as far as when, if it's a deliberate exception, what kind of suggestion you should give, and it goes through all the different scenarios. I'm not concerned that you know when you should give which suggestion. I just want to see that you know how to properly articulate the feedback in a way that complement is clear, the bridge links the two, and then you move into the suggestion that stems from something the client already has said and is not advice. And so just know that you can do observational and behavioral suggestions and practice seeing what they both feel like. So some feedback guidelines. Find the bottom line first. What suggestions does the interview data indicate? When you're unsure about what the bottom line is, go on the more conservative option. So instead of asking your client to do something really elaborate based on what they've told you, maybe go with just the observational. Observational suggestion is pretty safe, and in the very beginning when you're just learning more about your client, I often would give them just an observational suggestion because it helped them to start becoming more aware, but it also didn't give them too much too soon. So you'll know, and once you start experimenting with your clients, you'll have more and more of a sense of when it's okay to give them a little bit more, which would be a behavioral suggestion, or when maybe an observational suggestion is a better way to go for feedback. Develop those suggestions by assessing whether clients want something and how clear those goals are. Again, when you look at deliberate or random exceptions, that's going to help you. If it's a deliberate exception that they have expressed, where they knew exactly what they were doing and how they were part of that exception, then it will be very easy for you to suggest a behavioral suggestion because they've already given you the pieces and the actions that they took in the past. Now, if they give you a random suggestion where they really aren't sure what happened, it might be more effective for you to provide an observational suggestion. So this is why those pieces do help when it comes to giving feedback. Agree with what's important to the client and what client wants. In my scenario with Mary, the workaholic, her reasons for coming to see me is because she was trying to find a balance. She needed to get support so that she could properly balance her life between her work and her career and just her other aspects of life with her relationships and just her personal life. So agreeing with what's important to the client. Complimenting them for what they're doing and what's been helpful. Use that bridging statement, as we mentioned earlier, and then using clients' words, making sure to keep in tune with what those key words and themes are, so that way you can use that as you're providing them feedback. Feedback really is a very simple and straightforward process, and so oftentimes students will get bogged down with what to say and how to say it. Really just remember you need to compliment the strengths of your client, agree with whatever it is that they were trying to gain from their session. And sometimes it might be that it might feel more comfortable instead of saying, I agree with you that you need a balance in life. It might be, I can imagine, or it makes sense that you would want to find a balance. So you play with whatever wording feels right to you in that aspect, but it really is just joining the client's desire with what you're trying to do and what their goals are. And then deliver feedback deliberately and authentically, making sure that you stay genuine and that you're trying to provide those suggestions to the client that might help them as they leave your session. And they may never return because it might be the last session, or they might be able to come back the next week and tell you how those suggestions may have helped or what was helpful for them in that week. Another suggestion that's different from behavioral and observational, but still fairly related to the observational suggestion, is overcoming the urge suggestion. Sometimes your client may have something that's more internal. It's an inner tendency where maybe they're dealing with anxiety or with anger or with any type of depression or anything that's just more internalized. What you can do is have your client observe and watch out for times when they overcome the urge. Maybe your client is dealing with an eating disorder, or they're dealing with just whatever it is that's more internal. A way you can provide the suggestion is to have them look for the times when they maybe have that feeling coming up. Maybe they're starting to feel anxious, or maybe they're starting to feel angry, and they overcome the urge to do the negative behavior that they're trying to stay away from. So for example, this is how you would word it. And the next week, I'd like you to pay attention for those times when you overcome the urge to get angry. Pay attention to what's different about those times, especially what you're doing to overcome the urge. Sometimes those urges are very strong for our clients, especially if they're dealing with addictions. And so we want to let them take note of what pieces are making me successful when I overcome the urge, even if it's just one time this week where I overcome the urge to take that first drink. And find out what it is that helps make that client successful in those moments. And then we're going to amplify that. So again, we did this in the previous lecture, but I wanted to bring it all back again. Looking at the whole picture, those affirming skills that you use throughout the interview that help affirm the client and help them to feel heard and understood. It's our empathy, our echoing clients' key words, focusing on their strengths, clarification, reflection, paraphrasing, and summarizing. We use those throughout the session. But as far as the actual sequence of how things flow, and I did a little bit about this in the previous lecture, but I wanted to just bring it in a slightly different angle. You start off with that names and small talk, clarifying how you work. Understand why the client is here. What about their problem makes it a problem? What do they want instead? And find the details about what they've done that's helpful, and then try to understand their perspective about their circumstance. Then moving into goal formation, so what do they clearly want? What miracle question and those follow-up questions. Continue to explore with the client so that they can fully paint that picture. And then looking into exceptions, which we just discussed. When has the miracle happened already? Exploring who, what, when, where, how. And painting this picture as well so that you have a really clear view of what happens when those exceptions take place. Scaling, then you take your thinking break, and then feedback, which includes the compliments, the bridge, and the suggestions. For your first session with the client, it's helpful to sometimes assume that they will just come back and just ask that. And so say something like, I'd like to be able to meet with you again if you feel like that would be helpful. What do you think about that? And so that a client can either say, yes, I want to come and see you again next week, or if they don't, then they could tell you that as well. If this is their second session or beyond, it's helpful to let the client guide that process. And instead, you might say something like, I feel it could be useful, but what do you think about returning? Or do you feel would be useful at this point in your journey? So that way they can let you know how many sessions they think is helpful. And we'll get more into termination later. As a reminder, your textbook has a great appendix that has really helpful interviewing protocols that break down this process in a similar fashion. So make sure to refer to that. And of course, continue practicing your skills. And thanks for joining us.